The size of the packer works as an indicator for how much mortar I want to add underneath the paver. I always want slightly more mortar than needed, so some of it squeezes out the side of the paver. This helps ensure we don't have any air bubbles or voids compromising our bond to the foundation.
You come and go like a monsoon rain. You hide and show like a lightning bolt. You have it all.
Last week we got all that concrete poured all the way through our entire staircase. Today we're going to be ripping out all the timber forms and grinding our concrete down wherever it has any irregular bumps. We had a bit of a doggy paw incident over in this slab. It's not really going to affect what we do because we're sticking pavers right over the top of it. I've already ground off the bumps for this one. I did it whilst the cement was still soft. And when we stick our pavers over the top, it'll be fine. Pulling the formwork off from my concrete is one of my favourite parts of the job because I love looking at how the concrete's turned out. I start this process at the top of the staircase and work my way down. After removing all the screws on a piece of formwork, I give it a light tap with a hammer and it usually releases it from the concrete. I like to clean my formwork up as I go whilst the concrete's still soft. I'll be reusing these pieces of timber later on another project. By pre-drilling all my screw holes when I constructed the formwork, it makes it easy for the screws to back out during this process. All the screws get recycled for future projects, so I collect them in a container as I remove them. I like to keep a tidy job site as I'm removing my formwork, so I don't create any trip hazards for myself. Sometimes the screw heads get clogged with concrete, so I use another screw with my impact driver to clear out the head, and then the screw can be removed from the form timber. When I pull off the formwork, I get to see how well our concrete pour turned out. Here we can see there's no voids or air bubbles, so we got a good solid pour. The form on the very top of our staircase requires a bit of excavation. I backfilled this formwork with sand and gravel for the process of pouring the concrete. This was to help stop the weight of the concrete pushing the timber out and creating a bow in it. I used my lump hammer and crowbar to pry the forms free, which is why I let the concrete set up over the weekend. I usually like to give the slab at least 48 hours to set completely solid before I start ripping forms out. I want it strong enough to survive the process without chipping and cracking.
9 to 5 was my dad's advice. Don't think twice, I want the luxury life. My beauty can lose it, I'll use it. I'll take what I want. Oh yeah. A whole lot of ticking, but not enough time. A whole lot of work for a trophy.
With the formwork out of the way, I can reposition this ag pipe tight up against the concrete. This way there will be plenty of room for the plants that are going to be here later. I'm digging a trench just deep enough to keep the pipe under the surface of the ground. I'm also extending the ag pipe so it can run all the way down to near the bottom of our staircase. This will help the water we've redirected underneath the slab to leach out evenly into the garden bed. I backfill the trench with some of our leftover concrete, gravel and sand mix. This will work well for allowing the water to seep out and water the garden that'll be here in the future. The final step in preparation before we start sticking our pavers down is to remove any bumps or high points in the concrete. I want the concrete slab as flat as possible when it comes to sticking the pavers down. I do this by using my grinder with a diamond bit and mainly work around where the edges of the formwork were. In the process of pouring the concrete, it's not perfect, so I often end up with high points on the edges of where the formwork and the concrete combine.
Whole lot
double checking the concrete form is going to fit the pavers I selected by doing a rough layout of the first 3 steps. I want to make sure the treads and risers fit accurately, but also leave a space for the cement that'll be bonding them to the concrete. I'm trying out different size packers underneath the pavers to simulate the thickness of the mortar we'll be applying later. Using my set square, I double check that the treads are going to have a 30mm overhang on the front of the step. Now that I'm satisfied our formula is going to work out, I start bringing in some of the pavers we're going to need to construct the first 3 steps. I consult my drawing to help me estimate how many pavers I'm going to need and where to stack them. The pavers are really heavy to move around, so I don't want to double handle them. I don't want to put them in the wrong spot so they get in my way. This is where the drawing comes in really handy for working out quantities of material and where we want to stack them. With all our pavers in place, I'm ready to mix our first batch of mortar we'll be sticking them down with. I'm going to be using 2 types of mortar. One's a purpose-made tile cement and the other one is standard brick mortar. I'll be using the tile cement for the first batch. I use this in areas where there's only a small gap between the paver and the concrete foundation. In areas where the mortar gap's going to be wider than 5mm, I use the standard brick mortar mix. I set myself up with all my tools on top of a towel. This way I can catch any spills as they happen. I also keep a bucket of clean water with a sponge in it to clean up any tile cement that gets in the wrong place. I start the process of cladding our charcoal pavers by dry fitting the first 2. As part of the design choice of having an offset brick pattern for our pavers, the first paver on the riser is going to be a half brick. To achieve a really strong bond, I apply tile cement to both surfaces, starting with the concrete foundation and then buttering the back of the charcoal paver. I then place the paver in the correct position and squeeze it in place. I want to put enough pressure on it so some of the tile cement oozes out the side of the paver. I then check with my spirit level that it's sitting perfectly vertical and make any necessary adjustments by tapping it gently with my rubber hammer. When I'm satisfied it's sitting in the correct position, I move on to buttering the next brick in preparation for placement. Because of the decking we're tying our staircase into isn't completely flat and level, I'll be using different size packers underneath the pavers to keep them completely horizontal and flat. I double check this paver's sitting completely vertical and then move on to repeat the process all the way along this first step.
I go red when you're sitting nearby. I'm like a young child. Oh, it's silly how time just flies when we play and you hide. You come and go like a monsoon rain. You had a show like a lightning bolt. You had it all.
Whilst the tile cement is still soft enough for adjustment, I want to double check this first row is completely flat and horizontal. As I mentioned earlier, the deck isn't completely flat, so I've been compensating for this by adding different size packers underneath the pavers. By laying my long level across the top of this first row, I can see if any of the pavers are out of alignment. I can then make adjustments using my chisel as a lever and adding a different size packer underneath. It's important to check this before the tile cement becomes completely solid, and then I wouldn't be able to adjust any of these pavers. With everything looking flat and level, I finish off this first row with the last 2 pavers. I've custom cut the last paver to fit the width of our staircase.
Oh, it's silly how time just flies when we play and you hide. You come and go like a monsoon rain. You had a show like like a lightning bolt. You have it all.
After doing one final check with my spirit level, this completes the first row of our paved staircase. I let the tile cement set up solid overnight before we continue by adding the first set of steps tomorrow. It was really important to take my time and get the layout as horizontal, plumb and flat as possible for this first course, as it becomes the foundation layer for the rest of the entire staircase. The next morning, when the ceramicrete tile cement is dry and set solid, I start the process of adding the tread for this first step with the 200 by 400 charcoal pavers, keeping the concrete foundation clean and dampening it with a sponge helps the adhesion of the tile cement. I'm using a packer placed under the back of the tread. This is to help create a very slight slope in the step so water can drain off the step and avoid puddling in the corner. I dry fit the paver on top of the packer and check with my level. When I'm confident I've got the right slope, I start the process of adding the tile cement to the foundation and to the back of the paver. When I've applied enough tile cement to the concrete foundation, I return the packer to its position. This is going to help set the paver on the correct slope we checked earlier. When the back of the paver has its complete coverage of tile cement, I place it on the concrete foundation and squeeze it down over the mortar using my rubber hammer to help seat it in place. I scrape off any excess tile cement with my spatula and clean up any spills with my water and sponge before moving on to prepare for the next paver.
Daydreamer, kidnap me. Take me back, all the way back to them days. Running around in a gown and a crown, barefoot.
The packers I'm using to create the gradual slope to help the steps be self-draining varies from one paver to the next. There's a slight variation in the thickness of the pavers and also a variation in our concrete foundation. So I take my time and double check with my level to make sure that we're creating a very slight slope, but will avoid any puddling on the steps, which creates staining and discoloring later on. As I mentioned previously, I'm using two different types of mortar to stick our pavers down. When the gap between the paver and the concrete foundation is larger than about 3 mil, I use standard mortar mix. I do this for a couple of reasons. One is the mortar mix is a little stiffer and helps support the paver when you have to use a thicker amount of mortar between the paver and the foundation. And the other is to save money. The mortar mix is about 1/3 of the cost of the tile cement. So for most of the pavers on this project, I'll be sticking them down with mortar mix. The application is the same for both products, making sure I get a really good adhesion on both surfaces, adding enough mortar so that when we set the paver in place, some of the material squeezes out the side. This ensures a solid contact between the paver and the foundation.
As a young girl, the fields were mine. We played hide and seek for hours, raised our shadows among the pines.
When I reach the end of this first step, I use my set square to double check the overhang on the front edge and then scribe a cut mark in preparation for my wet saw. After aligning the blade of the wet saw with my pencil mark, I cut the paver in multiple passes, going slightly deeper as I push it back and forth. This ensures a dead straight cut and also helps the diamond blade on the wet saw last longer. I give the cut paver a thorough wash to ensure it's going to adhere to our concrete foundation. I return the paver in place to double check that it's going to fit properly and then mortar it in place the same as we've done with all the pavers.
No mistake ever kept me late. We spent summers catching fireflies and winters on our skates. One big smile across my face. We used to dance our way to church on Sundays. Mama set the pace. Daydreamer, kitten and maid.
With the first step complete, we start on the second step above, keeping a couple of critical things in mind. We want this next row of pavers to stay completely vertical. They also have to stay level, and we want to make sure that we keep the same pattern that we've established in the first row. Our pattern is a classic brick pattern of setting the course of bricks halfway offset from the row below. I double check I'm keeping this consistent with my set square and make adjustments where necessary to keep the next course of bricks exactly halfway set on the course below. The first course of bricks is set up solid enough for me to remove the packers I use to keep them level. I use a lot of packers in a project like this, so I try and recycle as many as possible.
Daydreamer, kitten and maid, have me running around in a gown and a crown, barefoot. Have me running around, dressed in a gown, barefoot.
As we start laying the pavers for the second step, there's a couple of critical things to keep in mind. I want to make sure I'm setting the level of the paver, leaning slightly forward to maintain our rain drainage. I use my set square to check the pavers set square to the foundation. This is important to keep all the pavers in alignment. When the paver is set to the correct level in the dry fitting process, I move my packer out of the way to add the mortar, keeping it parallel to its original position. So once I have the mortar in place, I can return it back to the exact same spot. The size of the packer works as an indicator for how much mortar I want to add underneath the paver. In this case, it's a 3mm packer, so I know I need to add about 4mm of mortar. I always want slightly more mortar than needed, so some of it squeezes out the side of the paver. This helps ensure we don't have any air bubbles or voids compromising our bond to the foundation. This is why I have a packer underneath the paver. So when I set the paver with my rubber hammer, squeezing the mortar out, the paver will maintain the original level we set during the dry fit. When the paver's been tapped down to its correct level, I clean up the excess mortar and double check the square one last time before moving on to the next paver and repeating the process. On setting this next paver, you can see here how I've changed the thickness of the packer to get it to the correct height. I add the mortar in layers to get it to the correct thickness, sitting slightly above the packer. It's also important to have a thorough and complete coverage of mortar on the back of the paver. When I set it in place and squeeze down on the mortar, I can feel it settle on the packer. Then I know it's at the right level. I always do one final check with my level and set square, and then clean up any spills with my sponge and water. When the second step is complete, I reset for the third course of risers. I like to have these set in place so they can set up overnight, so the next day I can put pavers on top of them.
Quiet voices in the night. Time is running out of sight. A lonely wind is passing by, tries to carry all the whispers that it finds. The walls are listening when we talk, making echoes as we walk. There's no one left but you and me. It's like a made-up place that only we can see. Hold my hand and hear the words I say. Close your eyes and let us fade away. Build a secret place for you and me. Let our minds be caught up in a dream. look into each other's eyes. There's no one left but you and me. It's like a made-up place that only we can see.
That completes the first stage of our staircase. Join me in the next episode as we complete our project by finishing off the platform stairs that take us up to the driveway.
I hear the sound of empty streets. Yesterday has gone to sleep, so all that's left is you and me. I can't promise you're the only thing I see. Hold my hand and hear the words I say. Close your eyes and let us fade away. Build a secret place for you and me. Let our minds be caught up in a dream. Quiet voices in the night. Time is running out of sight. A lonely wind is passing by. Tries to carry all the whispers that it finds. The walls are listening when we talk, making echoes as we walk. There's no one left but you and me. It's like a made-up place that only we can see. Hold my hand and hear the words I say. Close your eyes and let us fade away. Build a secret place for you and me. Let our minds be caught up in a dream. Standing underneath the lights, look into each other's eyes. There's no one left but you and me. It's like a made-up place that only